This is a video about the book Sense and Sensibility. This video comes to you in two parts. Part one, the awful characters. So, Sense and Sensibility was the first book that Jane Austen wrote. Started writing it when she was 19. My suspicion is that at that age, she hadn't been out with people a lot and she'd maybe been exposed to situations where she was forced to have society with people that she just really weren't her match in terms of intelligence or sense or morals. This is just what I'm getting from Sense and Sensibility, because the characters in Sense and Sensibility are awful. And there's that strong sense of frustration where you're not independent, you're a woman, you're a young single woman, two sisters, and you just rely on the kindness of friends and your circumstances for your society. The book begins with a fall, so they were the young ladies of Norland, but when their father died they were basically disinherited from their estate. Well, that's the simple way of putting it. The complicated part doesn't bear going into. So I've done a Venn diagram here of the characters, I don't know if you could see it, but the characters of Sense and Sensibility. They are almost all either awful or foolish. So you can screenshot that if you want, but I'm just going to go through it. So the only characters who are both good and sensible are Eleanor, Edward Ferrars, and Colonel Brandon. And even Colonel Brandon and Edward aren't that great. Edward gets into a foolish engagement and then pursues it. He doesn't realise until Eleanor points it out to him. Oh, by the way, major spoilers for Sense and Sensibility. Do not watch this if you have not read it, unless you don't mind spoilers. So, at the end, when Edward and Eleanor are finally engaged, Eleanor is able to point out to him what a terrible person Lucy is, but he doesn't see it. And even after the affection is gone, he just thinks, oh, well, I just didn't understand. I didn't want to break the engagement because I thought, you know, if she stayed engaged to me, even with me having no money, then she must really love me. And Eleanor was like, yeah, but you underestimated the level, the degree to which her selfishness will go, and obviously she didn't have any scruples in continuing engagement right up to the point that she was engaged to someone else. Anyway, so Edward got taken in, and I think that's a little bit foolish. I mean, forgivable and understandable, but still not super sensible. And Colonel Brandon's obsession with Marianne, I think, goes beyond sensible. So that's all on the good and sensible people, of which we've decided that there's just Eleanor. She's not a perfect character, but she's obviously a good person and she's able to exert herself. It's all about exerting yourself. And yeah, she falls in love, but she deals with it and she doesn't get taken in by stupid people. Now let's move on to the good and the good and foolish people. So that would be Mrs. Jennings, good, but just ridiculous, just loves talking about people's crushes all the time. Mama Dashwood, as distinguished from Mrs. John Dashwood. So yeah, she's good, but just gets run away with her feelings, just the same as Marianne Dashwood, like they're pretty much the same in that respect. And then Sir John and Mrs. Jennings are the male and female equivalent of each other. Which is interesting to me because I find these like next generation relationships interesting. So Colonel Brandon and Mama Dashwood are like besties. Like today's day, those two probably would have married, but she would only be like 5 years older than him, maybe 4. And Sir John and Mrs. Jennings would also be kind of close in age, like she would only be 5 or 10 years older than him. So I just find that kind of interesting, those couplings. So the people who are sensible but awful are Lucy Steele, who is just so smart and cunning and like pathologically selfish. I feel like she's so awful, but you just can't help admiring how she just doesn't care. She'll just do anything to further her own motives. And Fanny Dashwood, yeah, I don't know if she is that sensible, but she's not super foolish. And I've got John Dashwood under sensible but awful, but actually John Dashwood isn't sensible at all. He's quite foolish because he's just completely under the influence of his wife, who's just criminally selfish. So there we go. We've got the sensible people who use their intelligence for evil rather than good, which is Lucy Steele and Fanny Dashwood. And I found it really funny at the end when they end up being close relations. There's just this constant tension between them. They're competing for Mrs. Farrar's adulation. And so then we've got the foolish and the awful, which is Mrs. Farrar's, who's like a caricature of herself. She's just like this evil woman, but I found it really funny at the end when she was like, she just didn't want to be accused of being generous. And then Miss Steele, her first name might be Maria, Lucy Steele's older sister, who just won't stop talking about her beaux. It's just awful as well. Like, she eavesdrops on her sister. She just has no sense of propriety and just not a nice person. Selfish, just not clever like her sister, and just really rude. And then Lady Middleton, just completely insipid. And Willoughby, obviously, the classic Austen scoundrel. But I love that Austen, she does these like extreme stereotype characters, but she just gives them a twist of humanness. So with Mrs. Farrar's, she just makes a little joke about how it's almost like she's trying to be awful on purpose. And with Willoughby, she gives him his chance at seeking forgiveness. Just like shows his side of the story and like says that his good attribute is that he's like so personable. But also that's his downfall. So now on to Marianne, and when I started doing these videos about books and Asperger's, what was it now, 3 years ago? My idea was to look at characters in books that I think have Asperger's. Now I'm not sure about Marianne. I won't diagnose her as having Asperger's, but I will say that she's very similar to me, and the relationship between Marianne and Eleanor is, I would say, archetypal of that between a person with Asperger's and their neurotypical aid, I would say. So in my case, like, I would say that my sister has probably, like my older sister, probably helped me along without me realising it, the way that actually both my sisters have helped me along without me realising it. The difference here is that Eleanor kind of takes on a mother role, which is not really appropriate, but it's just because her mother is just completely indulgent and won't give direction to me. Okay, just had an issue with memory. So Eleanor kind of takes on the role of mother to Marianne. So this is a role that neurotypicals do for Aspies, and I'll link to a Penelope Trunk article about it below. But not only is it something that you don't get paid for, it's something that sometimes costs you money and certainly gets very little appreciation from it. So let's go through some of the ways in which Marianne and I are similar in a sense that could relate to Asperger's. So Marianne is not interested in social niceties. She just doesn't see the point. In this case, they're out to dinner or whatever it is after dinner with some friends, company. Lady Middleton proposed a rubber of casino to the others. No one made any objection but Marianne, who with her usual inattention to the forms of general civility exclaimed, "Your ladyship will have goodness to excuse me. You know I detest cards. I shall go to the pianoforte. I have not touched it since it was tuned." And without farther ceremony she turned away and walked to the instrument. Lady Middleton looked as if she thanked heaven that she had never made so rude a speech. And so this is where the neurotypical comes in to smooth things over. "Marianne can never keep long from that instrument, you know, ma'am," said Eleanor, endeavouring to smooth away the offence. "And I do not much wonder at it, for it is the very best toned pianoforte I ever heard." The remaining 5 were now to draw their cards. "Perhaps," continued Eleanor, "if I should happen to cut out, I may be of some use to Lucy Steele in rolling her papers for her." Sorry, Miss Lucy Steele. "And there is so much still to be done to the basket that it must be possible. I think for her labour singly to finish it this evening. I should like the work exceedingly if she would allow me a share in it." "Indeed I shall be very much obliged to you for your help," cried Lucy, "for I find there is more to be done to it than I thought there was, and it would be a shocking thing to disappoint dear Anna Maria after all." Blah blah blah. Eleanor joyfully profited by the first of these proposals, and thus by a little of that address, which Marianne could never condescend to practice, gained her own end and pleased Lady Middleton at the same time. This is just showing how Eleanor does what Marianne just can't be bothered doing. So Eleanor was able to get what she wanted, which was to talk to Lucy, and please Lady Middleton, whereas Marianne just didn't give a shit. Another point on the whole Eleanor being Marianne's mother thing, the crossover of roles actually does cause a problem, because when Marianne is maybe or maybe not engaged to Willoughby, Eleanor doesn't have the position to ask, whereas if she were her mother, she would, she would be allowed to ask. And so she tries to get the mum to ask, but she's like, oh no, I couldn't do that. Apart from that, an example of Marianne relying on her sister to smooth over the social niceties that she's not interested in doing. It's when they are driving with Mrs. Jennings to London, and Mrs. Jennings has offered to, be their host in London and their chaperone and all that. They were 3 days on their journey, and Marianne's behaviour as they travelled was a happy specimen of what her future complaisance and companionableness to Mrs. Jennings might be expected to be. She sat in silence almost all the way, wrapped in her own meditations, and scarcely ever voluntarily speaking, except when any object of picturesque beauty within their view drew from her an exclamation of delight exclusively addressed to her sister. To atone for this conduct, therefore, Eleanor took immediate possession of the post of civility which she had assigned herself, behaved with the greatest attention to Mrs. Jennings, talked with her, laughed with her, and listened to her whenever she could, and Mrs. Jennings, on her side, treated them both with all possible kindness, was solicitous on every occasion for their ease and enjoyment, and only disturbed blah blah blah. So she was just great. This is interesting because Marianne isn't really aware. She's being quite hypocritical here, because she wants to go to London so she can see Willoughby, and Mrs. Jennings has invited them, and she can't stand Mrs. Jennings because she just finds her impertinent and just, foolish, as we discussed. But she's gone anyway so that she can see Willoughby, so that's pretty crap. Yeah, you can understand that she doesn't have the natural inclination towards social niceties that her sister does, but there is also a point at which you can be quite selfish. And she's being selfish by taking advantage of Mrs. Jennings' hospitality and kindness without giving her what they have in return, which is women like Mrs. Jennings would take the girls along with her just for the companionship. So it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. And that's what Mrs. Jennings got out of it, and Marianne's just withholding. So on page 116 of this copy, which is the complete works of Jane Austen, which the Jane Austen book club ladies would disapprove of, and I do as well, but I just got it because it was all the Jane Austen they had at the library in Weeper. So this is an example of how Marianne doesn't know what other people are doing around her to, make life easier for her. Her carefulness in guarding her sister from ever hearing Willoughby's name mentioned was not thrown away. So Eleanor's carefulness from guarding Marianne from hearing Willoughby's name. Marianne, though without knowing it herself, reaped all its advantage, for neither Mrs. Jennings nor Sir John, nor even Mrs. Palmer herself, ever spoke of him before her. Eleanor wished that the same forbearance could have extended towards herself, but that was impossible, and she was obliged to listen day after day to the indignation of them all. So it's painful for Marianne to hear Willoughby's name, obviously, but it's Eleanor's pain could only be second to that because they're so close, but she just has to put up with them talking about it all the time. Now, just so that we don't think that it's all terrible to be Aspie, here's a hilarious example of how it's actually awesome. When the ladies withdrew to the drawing room after dinner, this poverty was particularly evident, as in poverty of conversation. For the gentlemen had supplied the discourse with some variety, the variety of politics, enclosing land and breaking horses. But then it was all over, and one subject only engaged the ladies till coffee came in, which was the comparative heights of Harry Dashwood and Lady Middleton's second son William, who were nearly of the same age. Had both the children been there, the affair might have been determined too easily by measuring them at once, but as Harry only was present, it was all conjectural assertion on both sides, and everybody had a right to be equally positive in their opinion and to repeat it over and over again, as often as they liked. The two parties stood thus. The two mothers, though each really convinced that their own son was the tallest, politely decided in favour of the other. The two grandmothers, with no less partiality but more sincerity, were equally earnest in support of their own descendant. Lucy, who was hardly less anxious to please one parent than the other, thought the boys were both remarkably tall for their age, and could not conceive that there could be the smallest difference in the world between them. And Miss Steele, with yet greater address, gave it, as fast as she could, in favour of each. Eleanor, having once delivered her opinion on William's side, by which she offended Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny still more, did not see the necessity of enforcing it by any farther assertion, and Mary Ann, when called on for hers, offended them all by declaring that she had no opinion to give, as she had never thought about it. It's just so good, because who gives a shit which boy is taller? Seriously, no one other than the parents, or people trying to impress the parents, and by parents I mean mothers in this case. Another case at the same dinner party is when Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny are just being completely awful to Eleanor, torturing her basically. John, Eleanor and Marianne's brother, shows the screen that Eleanor did to Colonel Brandon because he's trying to make them get together. And then everyone ends up looking at the screens, and Mrs. Ferrars and Fanny are looking at them. Mrs. Ferrars, not aware of their being Eleanor's work, particularly requested to look at them, and after they had received the gratifying testimony of Lady Middleton's approbation, Fanny presented them to her mother, considerately informing her at the same time that they were done by Miss Dashwood. So, obviously, this is helping her to know not to say anything too nice. Said Mrs. Ferrars. Very pretty, and without regarding them at all, returned them to her daughter. Perhaps Fanny thought for a moment that her mother had been quite rude enough, for colouring a little, she immediately said, "They are very pretty, ma'am, aren't they?" But then again, the dread of having been too civil, too encouraging herself, probably came over her, for she presently added, "Do you not think they are something in Miss Morton's style of painting, ma'am? She does paint most beautifully. How beautiful her last landscape is done." "Oh, beautiful indeed, but she does everything well." Marianne could not bear this. She was already greatly displeased with Mrs. Ferrars, and such ill-timed praise of another at Eleanor's expense. Well, this is very frustrating. Where's the camera? My video camera is being ridiculous and refuses to take on any more footage, even though I deleted everything that was on there. Back to the point. Marianne could not bear this. She was already greatly displeased with Mrs. Ferrars, and such ill-timed praise of another at Eleanor's expense, though she had not any notion of what was principally meant by it, provoked her immediately to say with warmth, "This is admiration of a very particular kind. What is Miss Morton to us? Who knows or who cares for her? It is Eleanor of whom we think and speak." And so saying, she took the screens out of her sister-in-law's hands to admire them herself as they ought to be admired. Mrs. Ferrars looked exceedingly angry, and drawing herself up more stiffly than ever, pronounced in retort this bitter philippic, "Miss Morton is Lord Morton's daughter." So Miss Morton is also the one that they want Edward to marry. I just love that because, yeah, they were being horrible and she called them out on it. And so she should have. And this is another hilarious example. So it's just so horrible. Lucy still is awful. Marianne asks Edward why he wasn't at the party, the one that we were just quoting from, and he says, "I was engaged elsewhere." Engaged? But what was that when such friends were to be met? "Perhaps, Miss Marianne," cried Lucy, eager to take some revenge on her, "you think young men never stand upon engagements if they have no mind to keep them, little as well as great." Eleanor was very angry, but Marianne seemed entirely insensible of the sting. So this was a dig at Willoughby leaving her. For she calmly replied, and this is just so funny, because as you know the context, Edward and Lucy Steele are secretly engaged. Eleanor knows they're engaged. He doesn't know that she knows, and Marianne doesn't know at all. Not so, indeed. For seriously speaking, I am very sure that conscience only kept Edward from Harley Street, and I really believe that he has the most delicate conscience in the world, the most scrupulous in performing every engagement, however minute, and however it may make against his interest or pleasure. He is the most fearful of giving pain, of wounding expectation, and the most incapable of being selfish of anybody I ever saw. Edward, it is so, and I will say it. What, are you never to hear yourself praised? Then you must be no friend of mine, for those who will accept of my love and esteem must submit to my open commendation. The nature of her commendation in the present case, however, happened to be particularly ill-suited to the feelings of 2/3 of her auditors, and was so very unexhilarating to Edward that he very soon got up to go away. I just think this is funny because she's talking about how Edward would keep any engagement no matter how much he didn't want to, just because he is incapable of being selfish, and that is exactly why he's still engaged to Lucy Steele. So, to sum up, this is actually not really summing up. This is just a bit at the end. I find reading really helpful, and especially Jane Austen, the way she writes, she puts in what people say and do, but then also includes their motive and all the psychological background. And that's really helpful as a person with Asperger's who sometimes often doesn't understand people's behaviour. Reading can actually give me an insight, even though it's from the 1800s, an insight into today. And just from reading Sense and Sensibility, I got a good insight into sin. So talking about Willoughby, she gives a good description of sin and how it causes its own punishment. Obviously you hurt the other people more, but you also, in doing so, you end up punishing and hurting yourself. And about the comment about Fanny Dashwood having chosen a line of behaviour that she knows to be wrong feels more affronted when better is expected of her. This video is not really working very well narratively speaking because I just added this whole bit that had bore no relation to what came before. So I'll wrap it up by talking about Marianne's turning. Once the engagement between Lucy and Edward comes out, Eleanor is required to talk to Marianne about it and to encourage her to exert herself. And that means telling her the whole background and how she's known for the whole time. And Marianne's like, well, how have you managed it? And then she just like gives a bit of an answer. And then Marianne's, well, I'm not surprised because, you know, you obviously don't have any feelings. And that's just way too much for Eleanor. And she goes on this big thing about how hard it's been for her these last few months and how she's borne it all alone. And Marianne is so shocked and taken aback. Just, that's enough. So she promises to exert herself, which she does. And then going forward, she just becomes completely convicted by all the things that she's done that's been so selfish. She's indulged her own grief. She's been inattentive to every single person around her, even John and Fanny Dashwood, who were awful, but she's like, well, I didn't even give them what they were owed, even though it's not very much. And she just becomes a different person, I guess. Well, not a different person, but she just grows up. I mean, the ending is a bit unsatisfying in that she's given to Colonel Brandon as a reward. I mean, they do sort of set it up for her and they make it, but just Austen does say that everyone decides that Marianne should be his reward for every good thing he's done. And it's like, well, actually women don't work like that. But in today's, stories from today, TV shows and movies have the exact same narrative, that the woman is given as a reward for the hero. So you do see a sense of Jane Austen's strong disapproval towards sensibility and the need for reform, which is true, but I kind of feel like Marianne wasn't fully appreciated for what she does bring and for her good traits, and it was too much about, well, you should just be like Eleanor, even though Eleanor is not perfect and has her faults, and that's acknowledged. And Austen sort of gives her this happy ending that she has this complete change of belief because she marries Colonel Brandon not loving him. She highly esteems him and considers him as a friend, and she's like basically bows into the pressure, I suppose. But that it says that she goes on to love him as much as she did Willoughby because it's not possible for her to give a little bit of her heart to someone. Well, this is nice, but I still feel like there could have been more appreciation for her good character traits rather than emphasising the need for them to be moderated and for her to exert herself. So that's me on Sense and Sensibility. I hope I don't have too much trouble editing these 3 videos together. Bye.